I'm Diana, I'm 36, and since I was 5 years old, my father recorded every family fight, not the vacations, not the birthdays, not the happy moments, just the fights. To remember who said what, he'd claim, so nobody can lie afterward. But he never played the recordings when he lied. He never showed who started. He never let us hear his voice rising first, his hand hitting the table, his breathing accelerating before the first word came out. I grew up afraid of recorders, afraid of being heard, afraid that my voice, my version, my truth would be trapped on a tape that nobody would play in my defense. Until at 30, my mother attempted suicide. She took pills, left a note, survived by minutes. In the hospital while she slept, I went to the house. I searched for the tapes. I found 847, 31 years of arguments. And on the last one, recorded the night before the attempt, I heard something I'd never heard. My voice at 5 years old asking, "Why does Daddy yell?" And my mother's answer, choked, broken, "Because I don't know how to be quiet, Diana, because I talk when I should listen." It wasn't true. In the previous 846 tapes, my father yelled first, always, but my mother believed it was her fault, that her voice provoked, that her existence was the argument. And I, with 847 tapes in my car, with my mother breathing in the hospital, with 31 years of fear transformed into evidence, knew what to do. I wouldn't destroy the tapes. I would use them, all of them. At my parents' anniversary dinner with 40 guests, with my father's lawyer present, with the recorder he himself gave me when I turned 10, I projected 31 years of audio. Not edited, not selected. Complete. 847 arguments, 200 hours. One single truth. My father yelled first, always. And when the last tape ended, when my 5-year-old voice asked for the last time, "Why does Daddy yell?" And the silence of 40 guests filled the room, my mother, recently discharged, standing with the pills still in her system, said, "I didn't know how to be quiet, but now I know how to listen. And I hear that the one who yells first loses. And you, Carlos, lost 31 years ago." I grew up in a house where sound was weaponized. My father, Carlos, was a lawyer who understood the power of evidence, of documentation, of the carefully constructed record that could be used to prove any narrative he chose. He was precise, methodical, always prepared with the document, the citation, the precedent that would support his position. He applied these skills to his family with the same dedication he applied to his clients, building a case against my mother that spanned decades, that was supported by hundreds of hours of audio, that was unassailable in its completeness. My mother, Isabel, was a woman who loved to talk. Not to argue, not to provoke, but to connect, to share, to express the thoughts and feelings that accumulated in her mind and needed release. She was warm, expressive, the kind of woman who would chat with strangers on buses, who would tell stories that went on longer than necessary, who would repeat herself because the repetition was part of the pleasure, the rhythm, the connection she was trying to create. They were mismatched from the beginning, or perhaps they were matched perfectly, each providing the other with the exact challenge they needed to maintain their identity. Carlos needed someone to control, to correct, to document as excessive. Isabel needed someone to talk to reach, to try to connect with despite the growing evidence that connection was impossible. The recorder appeared when I was 5, a gift, Carlos said to the family. For memories, he claimed, for preserving the important moments. But he only recorded arguments. He was selective in a way that was invisible to us at first, that seemed natural, that we accepted because we didn't know to question. The first recording I remember was about dinner. Isabel had made something Carlos didn't like, or had made it wrong, or had made it at the wrong time. I don't remember the specifics. I remember the recorder on the table, its red light blinking, the small microphone positioned to capture everything. I remember Carlos's voice, controlled at first, then rising, then shouting. I remember Isabel's voice, responding, defending, eventually matching his volume. I remember my own voice, small, asking them to stop, asking why they were yelling, asking if I could leave. And I remember Carlos, after the fight, playing the tape for us. Not the beginning where his voice started. Not the middle where his accusations accumulated. Just the end where Isabel was shouting, where she was crying, where she was saying things that sounded unreasonable, that sounded excessive, that sounded like the provocation he claimed she was. "Listen," he said. "Listen to yourself, Isabel. Listen to how you sound. This is what you do. This is why we fight." She listened. She cried. She apologized. She believed him. Because the evidence was there, on the tape, in her own voice, saying things that she couldn't deny, expressing emotions that seemed excessive in the isolated context he provided. I didn't understand the manipulation at 5. I understood only that the recorder was present when people were unhappy, that its red light meant danger, that its presence transformed normal conversations into performances that could be used against us. I learned to be silent when it was around, to modulate my voice, to control my breathing, to avoid giving Carlos any evidence that could be used to prove I was the problem, the provocation, the source of the family's unhappiness. My brother Martin was born when I was 4. He learned faster than I did, or perhaps he learned from watching me, from seeing the consequences of being heard, of being recorded, of being documented. He became silent, invisible, the child who never caused problems, who never argued, who never gave Carlos any material to work with. He was praised for his calm, his reasonableness, his maturity. He was dying inside, but nobody recorded that, so it didn't exist. The tapes accumulated. Carlos bought new recorders as technology advanced, from cassettes to digital, from physical storage to cloud backup. He organized them meticulously, by date, by participant, by topic. Family arguments 1989 to 1995. Isabel's outbursts. Diana's attitude problems. The labels were his interpretation, his framing, his reduction of complex human interactions to categories that served his narrative. He used the tape strategically. When Isabel threatened to leave, he played excerpts that showed her instability, her unreasonableness, her inability to control herself. When I questioned his authority, he played tapes of my childhood tantrums, my hysteria, my excessive emotionality. When Martin tried to express an opinion, Carlos played tapes of previous conversations where Martin had contradicted himself, changed his position, been inconsistent. The tapes were not memory. They were control. They were the systematic construction of a reality where Carlos was always reasonable, always responding, always the victim of other people's excesses. And we believed it because the evidence was there, because we could hear our own voices saying things that seemed to prove his point, because we didn't know that the evidence was incomplete, edited, manipulated. I left at 25. I couldn't bear the recorders anymore, the fear of being heard, the knowledge that any conversation could be transformed into evidence against me. I became a journalist, specializing in audio forensics, the technical analysis of sound that reveals what is hidden, what is manipulated, what is true beneath the surface of what is presented. My work was my salvation and my obsession. I learned to analyze waveforms, to identify edits, to detect the microgaps that indicate splicing, the frequency changes that indicate processing, the acoustic signatures that reveal the true sequence of events. I applied these skills to my professional work, helping clients verify the authenticity of recordings, exposing manipulations, revealing truths that had been hidden by technical deception. But I didn't apply them to my family. I couldn't. The fear was too deep, the trauma too ingrained, the knowledge that confronting Carlos would mean becoming the subject of his next recording, his next campaign of documentation and control. I stayed away, visited rarely, called infrequently, maintained the distance that was necessary for my survival. At 30, my mother attempted suicide. Isabel, who had spent 35 years being recorded, being documented, being proven unreasonable, decided that the only solution was to stop existing. She took pills, wrote a note, lay down to die. She was found by a neighbor who noticed the mail accumulating, who called the police, who broke down the door and found her breathing barely minutes from death. I returned immediately. I sat by her bed in the hospital, watching her breathe with the assistance of machines, her body fighting to survive despite her intention to die. I read her note, which was not addressed to me or Martin or Carlos, but to the world, to the record, to the evidence she was trying to create. I am the problem, she wrote. I talk too much. I feel too much. I exist too loudly. Without me, there will be peace. Without me, Carlos will be happy. Without me, the recordings will stop. I read the note and understood, finally, completely, what Carlos had done. He had not just recorded her. He had convinced her that her existence was the argument, that her voice was the provocation, that her death was the solution. He had used 31 years of selective documentation to transform a human being into a problem that could be solved by elimination. I went to the house. Carlos was at the hospital, maintaining his performance of concern, of confusion, of the devoted husband who couldn't understand why his wife would do such a thing. I had the keys, the knowledge of where he kept his archives, the technical skills to access what he had hidden. I found 847 tapes, 31 years of arguments, of accusations, of carefully constructed evidence. They were organized in Carlos's system, labeled with his interpretations, stored in the climate-controlled environment that he maintained for his precious records. I took them, all of them. I loaded them into my car and drove to my apartment, to my studio, to the space where I had the equipment and the skills and the distance from Carlos to do what needed to be done. I began to listen. Not selectively, not according to Carlos's labels, but systematically, chronologically, completely. I started with the first tape, from 1989, when I was 5 years old, when the recorder first appeared, when the weaponization of sound began. I listened for weeks. I analyzed the waveforms, identified the patterns, documented the sequence of events that Carlos had hidden, and I found what I had always known but never been able to prove. Carlos started the arguments. Always. Not sometimes, not usually, but always. His voice appeared first in the recordings. His breathing accelerated before he spoke. His hand hit the table before Isabel responded. His accusations preceded her defenses. The pattern was clear in the technical analysis. In 94% of the recordings, Carlos's voice was the first to rise above normal conversational volume. In 89%, his breathing accelerated before the first word of the argument was spoken. In 100% of the recordings that Carlos had played for us, for Isabel, for the family, the beginning was missing, edited out, removed to create the impression that Isabel was the initiator, the provocateur, the source of the conflict. I found the tape from the night before the suicide attempt. Carlos had not edited it, had not had time, had been distracted by the events that were unfolding. It was complete from beginning to end, and it showed what the other tapes had hidden. Carlos preparing, breathing, moving, then exploding at Isabel for something minor, something forgettable, something that would not have caused argument in a normal household. And on that tape, at the beginning, before Carlos started, before Isabel responded, there was my voice. 5 years old, small, frightened, asking the question that I had forgotten asking, that had been edited out of every version I had heard. Why does Daddy yell? Isabel's response, choked, broken, accepting the blame that Carlos had trained her to accept. Because I don't know how to be quiet, Diana. Because I talk when I should listen. I listened to that exchange 100 times. I heard my 5-year-old self asking the right question, the question that Carlos had spent 31 years preventing me from asking. I heard my mother accepting the wrong answer, the answer that Carlos had trained her to give, the answer that had led her to believe that her death was the solution. And I understood what I needed to do. Not destroy the tapes, not hide them, not use them for private confrontation or personal revenge, but use them completely, publicly, to show the truth that Carlos had spent 31 years hiding. I prepared the presentation. I used my professional skills, my technical knowledge, my understanding of how to present evidence clearly and convincingly. I created a chronological sequence, a forensic analysis, a demonstration that would be undeniable, that would show the pattern, the manipulation, the systematic destruction of truth that Carlos had perpetrated. I chose the venue carefully. My parents' 40th anniversary dinner, organized by Carlos, attended by his colleagues, his friends, the people who had heard his version of the marriage, who had accepted his narrative, who had supported his control. I would use his audience, his stage, his performance against him. I arrived with equipment, the recorder he had given me when I was 10, so you can learn to document the truth. I had modified it, enhanced it, transformed it from a tool of control into a tool of revelation. I connected it to the sound system that Carlos had installed for his party, the speakers that would carry the truth to every corner of the room. The dinner proceeded normally. Carlos gave his toast, his speech about 40 years of marriage, about challenges overcome, about the love that had sustained them through difficult times. He was charming, persuasive, the perfect performer of the devoted husband role. Then I stood. I didn't announce what I was doing. I simply started the playback. The first tape from 1989, the beginning that Carlos had always hidden. His voice rising before Isabel said anything. His breathing accelerated before the first accusation. His hand hitting the table before Isabel responded. The room went quiet. People turned, confused, wondering what was happening, why the anniversary dinner had been interrupted by the sound of an old argument. Carlos stood, angry, demanding that I stop, threatening legal action, asserting his authority as the host, the father, the head of the family. I didn't stop. I played the next tape and the next, the sequence that I had prepared, the pattern that was undeniable. Each tape showed the same thing. Carlos starting, Carlos provoking, Carlos creating the conflict that he then blamed on Isabel. The edits were visible in the waveform, the gaps where he had removed the beginning, the jumps where he had cut the context, the manipulations that transformed his aggression into her defense. I played 200 hours of material, compressed into 45 minutes of strategic selection. Every example showed the same pattern. Every tape contradicted the narrative that Carlos had built. Every recording that he had used to control was now being used to free, and at the end, I played the last tape. The complete one from the night before Isabel's suicide attempt. My voice at 5 asking, "Why does Daddy yell?" Isabel's response, accepting blame that was not hers. The silence that followed, the silence that had lasted 31 years, the silence that was now broken. When the playback ended, I didn't speak. I let the silence work, let the evidence resonate, let the 40 guests process what they had heard. Carlos tried to speak, to explain, to reframe, to use his lawyer skills to create a new narrative that would incorporate this evidence into his version of the truth. But Isabel spoke first. She had come to the dinner against medical advice, still weak from the overdose, still processing the pills that were still in her system, still alive despite her attempt to die. She stood unsteady, supported by Martin, who had finally broken his silence, finally chosen a side, finally become visible. "I didn't know how to be quiet," she said. Her voice was weak but clear, the voice of a woman who had spent 35 years being recorded and was now, finally, being heard completely. "But now I know how to listen. And I hear that the one who yells first loses. And you, Carlos, lost 31 years ago." Carlos tried to respond, to argue, to use his legal training to create doubt, to question the evidence, to reframe the narrative. But the room was against him. The guests, his friends, his colleagues, had heard the truth, had seen the pattern, had understood what he had done. They didn't need legal proof. They needed only to listen, to hear what 31 years of selective recording had hidden, to understand that the evidence was complete, was undeniable, was devastating. A judge who was present, a friend of Carlos who had heard the entire presentation, spoke quietly. "The truth is not private, Carlos, and you made it public when you used the tapes to control. Diana simply completed what you started." Carlos sat down. He didn't speak again that night. He left the dinner, the party, the life he had constructed, and went home to a house that was empty of the family he had controlled, the wife he had convinced to die, the children he had recorded into silence. Isabel didn't leave him immediately. The process of recovery, of understanding, of rebuilding a self that had been systematically destroyed took years. She went to therapy with Martin as her therapist, the son who had finally become present, who had finally chosen to help, who had finally broken the silence that had been his survival strategy. She listened to the complete tapes, the ones that Diana gave her, the ones that showed the truth of her marriage, of her voice, of her right to exist without being recorded, documented, proven excessive. She learned to hear herself without Carlos's framing, to understand that her voice was not the problem, that her existence was not the argument, that her death would not have been the solution. Diana didn't create a foundation. She created a podcast, The Pattern, dedicated to forensic audio analysis of family conflicts. She helped victims of recording-based manipulation, of technological control, of the weaponization of sound that Carlos had pioneered, and that was becoming more common as technology advanced. The podcast was not large, but it was precise. It taught listeners to analyze their own recordings, to identify manipulation, to understand that the complete recording was always different from the selected excerpt, that the truth was in the context, in the beginning, in the pattern that emerged only when everything was heard. Years later, Diana received a message from a woman. "My husband records everything," the woman wrote. "He tells me I'm the one who yells, but I listen to your podcast. I learn to analyze." He starts, "Always, thank you for teaching me to hear what I wasn't allowed to hear." Diana responded with a single sentence. "Listen to the beginning, always the beginning. The rest is just response." If someone recorded you to control you, to prove you were the problem, to transform your defense into your provocation, hear me. The beginning is the truth. The pattern is the evidence. And the complete recording, heard completely, will always reveal what the selective excerpt was designed to hide. That's my story. If it spoke to you, comment below. If someone used technology to trap your truth, tell me. I'll read every word. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.